Okay. Let me get comfortable here. It's, I think, fact is, I was, I was a child of the '80s. I was a child of the '80s, and that being the case, they hammered home all the patriotic content, especially in Texas, where I grew up. They hammered home all the patriotic, material that you could want. There was nothing woke about, at least in the sense that some people would say about how I was brought up in the school sense of the term. And that's the thing. I'm not one of these people who gets the sort of nuance. I'm not, at least, in terms of, oh, this is what unwritten rules. I'm not one of these people who, you know, just s- follows by that sort of sensibility. There's this guy, a fellow, I forget his real name, but his tag is Metatron. And I enjoyed his material for many years. But recently, his stuff took a rather strong right turn, and it looks like he's, bought into the sort of the griftosphere. And I say this as somebody who respects his intelligence. He is not incapable of making a rational argument. He makes plenty. I've watched many videos where he, even if I didn't necessarily agree with him in the final analysis, he made very sort of methodical, logical arguments. Of course, the danger is when you're that sort of person, when you've got that sort of sensibility. I am methodical. I use logic. I am right. Ba ba da ba da. You can become a victim of your own ability to rationalize. Because, if you know the neuroscience of it, then you know that, our ability to reason isn't isolated in some, you know, vacuum. It's not isolated in some sort of, hermetically sealed thing where no emotion, no feeling, no prejudice, no bias can reach it. We're constantly trying to defend our own point of view. And it's important, I think, that we realize that it is a point of view. Because if we start to think that it's reality or complete truth, then we're in danger. But if I had to be asked what my point of view is and what it comes from, it's I take seriously what I was taught about the way our system is supposed to work. And that is that we our system is supposed to be one where the power of the government is conditional and our rights are unconditional with a few rather strictly regulated exceptions. And those strict regulations are the laws of this country and the Bill of Rights that is part of the basis for those laws and which are laws themselves. There's been here's the thing. If you asked me about Charlie Kirk, if you asked me honestly, if you asked, do you think he had it coming? Dangerous question to ask. Dangerous question to answer. But if I had to be honest, but also consistent with my principles, I would say I would say that part of the problem with the right wing in America is that it thinks it can provoke, it thinks it can deliver endless insults, it thinks it can trigger people endlessly. And I'm not even talking about, provoking a violent response. They think they can do that and not provoke a peaceful but antagonistic response. They look at what happened with Trump in 2020 and they think that that is some sort of fraud. That no, it couldn't possibly be that this guy who campaigned from his basement beat our guy who did 23 rallies. Well, in those 23 rallies, we can see part of what ended up destroying the first Trump presidency. And that is his indifference to the lives of Americans and the consequences of his policy and the consequences of all the crap he stirred up. You know? When you've got millions and millions of followers triggering people, that is, traumatizing them, their idea is that we just mentally browbeat these people into submission. And they've tried to do it again with this whole woke DEI sort of thing, trying to, you know, force their opposition into submission again and again. But there's something I would call the George McFly effect, I think. And that is that eventually, if you provoke people enough, if you trigger people enough, if you if you humiliate people, if you try and destroy people's will, some people will submit, but there will be people like myself whose past sort of psychology has taught them that instead, if somebody tries to do this to you, that you that you'll just stand up and you'll act against those people, that you'll redress the grievance, that you'll balance what occurred. And this is all up to this point, this is peaceful. This is the peaceful level of what happens. And so, what I would say first and foremost is there is a reason why, there's a good reason why Trump lost 2020. And that's quite frankly because he deserved to lose 2020, because he was alienated so many people, angered so many people, convinced so many people that he was incompetent to lead, convinced many people that he did not care if they lived or died, and in fact was willing to do things that would make it far more likely that they would die. His sociopathy shone through his actions, and those generated opposition. Now, is that to say that, so what how does this tie back to Charlie Kirk? Well, I just, first and foremost, I just say that he did not make his living by being a person who avoided controversy. But then again, I'm not a sort of person who avoids controversy myself. However, I try not to be too mean about it, you know? I try not to be, it's the first priority is not to destroy the other person. And I think that's overall. So, because Charlie Kirk isn't operating, he's not living in a vacuum. He's living in an environment where overall conservatives have stirred up a great deal of anger, a great deal of fear, and, you know, anxiety. They've created a situation where people are just not just themselves, but all over the nation, that people are fearful that our nation's fundamental rights are no longer worth the Constitution that they're printed on. That we're all just, you know, that we're all screwed, basically. What is the rational response to that? If you have taught kids for decades that their history, the foundation of their history is the founding fathers fighting a war of independence, fighting a revolution to overthrow tyranny, that that the right response to tyranny is to take it down by any means necessary. What do you think the what do you think that, if you've got this sort of gun, and it's worse yet, there is a gun culture that is developed that basically idolizes the gun as the means to preserve and protect liberty, which I'll actually say right here, that's not what I believe. I believe that there might come a day where if I want what I had in the nation of my birth, there might come a day where I have to take up arms, or others have to take up arms on my behalf in order to restore that freedom. I don't think it's quite yet, and wish to God, I hope to God that day does not come. But it is what we have been taught. It is what we are told is the point of all the guns that we're supposed to get. Which, there are a bunch of liberals like myself, lefties like myself, who are looking around at what's happening in this country and are wondering where are all the people who said that they would, that they were getting those guns for the day um, when tyranny would come. And they are. I think there's an easy answer to that, and the easy answer is that somehow through propaganda and a whole bunch of other social sort of manipulation, the people who see themselves as the best, most virtuous patriots have taken the side of the tyrant, and they've ignored something fundamental, something basic, underlying everything. They think, oh, the the republic is in danger, so we have to do everything we can to make sure that the liberals don't win. They have in their mind, they have conflated two things. They have conflated their sense of competition with folks like me. They've conflated that with their sense of patriotism. So they're thinking, unless we win, unless we make it to where there is no way other than our winning, if we have to make sure that we win forever and ever, and if that takes you know suppressing the woke mind virus, if it takes you know beating up these people, if it takes this, if it takes that, then it must be done. So they've taken to believing that they have to hammer on their opponents and win against their opponents by any means necessary in order to preserve that freedom, that liberty, and all that the other stuff that they claim to believe in. Only problem being that all the means not only do not justify the ends, the means completely undermine the ability to preserve and protect the ends. And not only that, they have chosen the worst possible person to give the most possible power to. That's the thing. They taught me too well. I paid attention in class. I paid attention to what I was being promised. I paid attention. I learned what it meant. I learned the details of it. I had a conservative for a civics teacher, but that civics teacher made sure I had the you know full picture of how the government worked, from the courts to the legislature and all the committees they're involved in, and how the committees set the agenda for these things. The I was I was taught what how agencies work, about enabling acts and things like that. This conservative teacher taught me basically from one side to the other, quite excellent civics class. And I remember it all. Am I somehow naive for believing in this? I don't think so. I don't think so. I have read through so much of history. I've looked at the way that other governments operate. I've looked at the way that the Soviet government operates. I've looked at the way the Nazi government operated. I've looked at it, and I've also, in the course of my life, learned about a lot of cognitive and psychological things. I've learned about the way in which, in the way, at least in the abstract, in the way people think. And I've come to the and I've also considered things from a central sort of philosophical point of view, starting things from basic underlying levels. And what it tells me is this: people are free to do whatever they want to. It has always been the case. If they decide tomorrow, you know what, I'm not going to work. If everybody made that decision tomorrow, the land comes to a standstill. And what would there be to stop them? Well, consequences, I suppose. But if everybody did it, if everybody walked off the job, tomorrow, could you fire everybody? Or if it was even most people, would you be just firing some people in order to hire the people who are fired by other people? It's but the point is, a lot of what we do, we actually do in a kind of loose, sort of tacit agreement with everybody else. All government works this way, is what I would say. All government works this way. The Chinese government, as authoritarian as it is, works this way. The people go along with it. If somehow they did not, that would be it. The government in Iran, if folks basically it works that way too. Sooner or later, if they don't want that government, it cannot endure. And if you think that's not the way things work, well, look at Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe. Basically, what happened was that the Soviets, they occupied Eastern Europe and never went home. And they set up these communist governments that were, powerful, that had, power over life and death for people. But the moment the Red Army withdrew, everything collapsed. In fact, it collapsed so fast that some people got the notion that this was actually a natural sort of state of affairs. That if we that essentially that anywhere that we intervened and set up a democracy, that would be the end of the tyrannical sort of situation there, which wasn't the case. But the truth is, it's like one way or another, every government needs somebody to say yes consistently when they ask things of them. The executioner in such a government, if they refuse to do that job, uh, then who's going to blow people away for them? If I mean, and you'll know it. You can see it in the way that things rearrange so quickly when a coup occurs, when somebody seizes this power or that power. It happens like an earthquake in many of these totalitarian regimes. It happens suddenly. You have these long periods where it seems like nothing much is up, and then suddenly everything changes. And it's not because you know the reality is something was happening underneath underneath the surface. And it's been happening here too. Something has been happening underneath the surface, and it's not been something good. It's been a sort of a rearrangement in people's heads of what how they think the country works and how they think the country should work. I don't watch Fox News. I don't want to watch Fox News. Just like that fella I mentioned, I don't think I've seen much of his material for the last 4 months. And part of the reason for that is that I just don't appreciate being insulted or treated like my point of view is a plague or I don't I don't particularly like that sort of thing going on. And as much as I can sympathize with the guy, he seems a nice enough person. At the end of the day, I think he's taking a wrong path. And I think I think a lot of what drives the right these days is a competitive kind of anger. And what they're angry about is that people don't want to follow them anymore. I mean, it used to be that I mean, if you look at, when the conservative movement was really getting up its sort of, you know, opposition to the left, to the Democrats, they were winning elections for the presidency that were like almost all the states in some cases. Like I think there was one election where, if memory serves, where President Reagan won all but maybe one state in the electoral college, and that was the way it was for the longest time. And then Bill Clinton came along and ruined that. But you know something? Here's an odd thing. When Bill Clinton came along and won the presidency, I was rooting for his opponent. I was rooting for George H.W. Bush to win. I was wanting another 4 years of the Republican president because when I was younger, I was very much influenced by the presidency that I'd grown up during. You know, but there's sort of an irony. There's sort of part of it I think was that I wasn't really aware of what was going on in terms of the policies, in terms of what they were trying to do. I was too young to understand that sort of thing. I was just, I was President Reagan was a very effective communicator, and he he expressed a patriotism in his speeches that sounded genuine. And it wasn't necessarily a mean-spirited sort of sense of things. He understood, if not practiced entirely consistently, he understood that, I mean, there's a reason why there is a category of, there was a category called the Reagan Democrat. That is the person who would vote for Democrats for Congress, but who would vote for, a Republican for president, who would, had might have socially or fiscally liberal attitudes, or might have a mix of different sort of things. But the Republican Party at that time understood that it was governing a nation where not everybody thought the same way, understood the same way. And then you had George H.W. Bush, who was a moderate Republican. Um, and he had a very he had a very grandfatherly sort of aspect to him. Had this sort of wise and, sort of, it, you can make fun of him, but he appealed to somebody like me because he had a sort of he had a sort of, I guess, positive, friendly sort of authority much of the time. And they and there was a class to them. They weren't these There was a sense of, they projected, even if they didn't always practice, a kind of decency. And they were able to reach across the aisle. They were able to do things that weren't entirely doctrinaire. I mean, what people don't appreciate is that, you had a number of Republican presidents during the Cold War, but there were there was almost always Democrats in charge. In fact, there were, from 1948 to 1994, the House of Representatives consistently was controlled by Democrats. The Senate might waver one way or the other, but the legislature was principally liberal, principally New Deal, which is part of what the Republicans were trying to avoid when they trashed and buried as much as they could Barack Obama's agenda. They didn't want a second New Deal occurring. They didn't want a second Great Society. and they've gotten their wish to a certain extent, but unfortunately they had to drive the nation insane in order to do it. And to this day, the concerns that drove people to elect a black man with a funny name when that had never happened before, the concerns that had driven them to do that, to seek that kind of change, they remain unanswered. They remain, in fact, things have gotten worse. They have taken what was their response to hope and change was a reckless sort of paranoid sort of grasping of power to try and lock things in place forever. They came to the conclusion that if people were getting sick of them, that the solution wasn't to, make themselves more sympathetic. The solution was basically to put so much crap in the zone, to put people in such a state of constant anxiety and fear and anger that they would they would flock to the Republicans in order to preserve their way of life, in order to preserve the country, in order to save the country. They had to make the Republicans the hero of a story where the only acceptable conclusion was Republicans running the nation. The problem is that in order to make things so to elevate political discipline, partisan discipline to such an art form, they basically had to just make crap up on a regular basis. They had to put things together in such a way where it was like not only couldn't you have any choice, but if you went for any other choice, you were a traitor who had to be destroyed. And that's the nation we're living in right now. A nation that has forgotten that at a basic level, it's like they talk about red pills, but they forget what the oracle told Neo. Everything that has a beginning has an end. The Republican Party has had a decent run, starting in 1860, running up till now. But I think it's committed a fatal mistake. I think it's committed a fatal mistake. And I'm not talking about them getting killed or anything. I'm talking about politically speaking. Y- They've they've made themselves slaves. I mean, what happens when let's just, say abstractly so that nobody has to get, you know, TDS bent out of shape about it. Let's say it was anybody else. And let's say you had somebody who was deteriorating not just in a a senior moment sort of way, not just in a zones out, sun's down, sundowns a little bit, but who is saying like we're going to invade Antarctica, a land that is mostly covered by ice. Somebody who put up a visual of a penguin marching not towards the sea but towards mountains, mountains where they will starve to death. We're heading that direction no matter what. What happens when you have somebody in charge who isn't all there? What happens when you have somebody in charge who you constantly have to handle, who isn't remembering things, who isn't understanding what's in front of them, who isn't understanding the consequences of what they do? Just look at all the incredible things that this leader has done over the last, and not incredible in a good way. Can you name the last president who just wholesale destroyed, a, a third to a half of the White House? If you ever heard of the the First Lady's office, if you ever heard of the White House cinema, guess what? That's been destroyed. Guys, we have a president who is treating our government like it belongs to him. It doesn't. It belongs to us. That's always been the point, that rather than it being some sort of monarchy, the people lead themselves in a very real sense. But we've decades of propaganda, decades of political slogans have led us to kind of forget what it is we're supposed to do as citizens. This is not supposed to be a government where we just fire and forget, where we just put somebody in the White House, put somebody in the Senate, put somebody in the House of Representatives, in the governor's mansion, in the state legislatures, in the courts, and just forget about it. We are supposed to be involved. We are not supposed to be just passive targets for government. That's the balancing thing of a liberal like myself. We're not supposed to be just passive targets for government. We're supposed to look at what our government is doing and talk back to that government. That's the point of the First Amendment. That's 75% of it, not just the nice things that we're basically able to you know it's not just the nice that I can say I think Star Trek 5 is the best Star Trek ever, which, by the way, I'm going to immediately say that that is not my opinion. Yeah. I do like the follow up though, Star Trek 6. You know, but it's you have a right to make to express opinions, not just because it is nice, not because it is, you know, lets you say controversial things, but because it lets you say things that some people might not want to hear, that some people might want to suppress. Folks talk about woke mindedness. What is woke mindedness? We pride ourselves on not being racist because we don't have hate in our hearts. But is it any better to doubt, say, that a black person has intelligence if you're doing it out of a misplaced sense of reason, where you think you've convinced yourselves that this is the case because of X, Y, and Z? Is that any better a reason to pull down, weigh down the prospects of a black person in an advanced field like, say, IT or something like that? Because I've had consistent experience, and they're often better at the job than I am, and I'm no I'm no moron here. But it's like it's like, is it any better to have a prejudicial attitude, a bigoted attitude, if you're not doing it with hate in your heart? Racism isn't simply bad because it comes from a place of hate. Racism is bad because it warps one's perspective on people. It has you standing in a person's entire and you know cohort of ancestry, if you will, their entire. I mean, if somebody, if you're a white person, let me ask you a question here. If somebody asked you whether you should be policed more harshly because some other people just like you got angry and rioted, would you have any patience with that sort of reasoning? Because I wouldn't. I wouldn't have any sort of patience with a reasoning that says, that because somebody over here misbehaved, that you have to be punished. That's not right. At the same time, at the same time, there are things that our system did as a whole that created a far from level playing field, not only between the races, but also between the genders, and also between people of different orientations and identities, to say the least. And they're trying to do the same with religion too. Make it to where if you don't have their religion, if you're atheist, if you're Buddhist, if you're animist, or if you're a Muslim, they want to make it to where that's inferior to everybody else. And you know something, I know that some people are very paranoid about Islam. Well, let me tell you something. I'm pretty paranoid about Christian fundamentalists, and not without reason. I've seen far too many examples of people who basically take their religion as a license to overthrow civil authority, even though there's a passage in Romans that tells them not to try and do that. At least, not to try and do it just for the sake of religious you know domination or something like that. I mean, to be blunt, we're told that God set authorities above you in order to so that to reduce wickedness. And that's the thing. They're not accepting that they need that kind of inhibition, that they need that kind of constraint. They've convinced themselves that they know best, that they'll do best. They've wrapped themselves up in this idea of, if they win, if they take control, then everything is better. In my state, the governor is trying to push religious scripture in the schools. And here's what I'm going to tell them. You push anything like that in the schools, here's what's going to happen. The children will disregard it as just another assignment. I mean, the little ones will start out going, "Okay, I'm, you know, I'm, I love God." Da 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 da. Da." The little ones will start out going, being, you know, enthusiastic about it. But then gradually, what will happen is that like you'll get towards 10, 11, the kids will start to get kind of a little rebellious. And so what will happen is that it will become cool to kind of regard the religious aspects of that as just adults trying to impose on them. We don't need no education, we don't need no thought control, no dark sarcasm in the classroom. And they won't be entirely wrong in this regard. And of course, when they reach teenage years, guess what? They'll really be rebelling against it. And how do I know this? Because I once was one of these teenagers. I once was one of these kids. At the very least, I observed my classmates, saw what they were doing. You know, there isn't anybody more cynical about the way the adult world is put together and all the requirements, all the things you have to do because you're a kid. There's nobody more cynical about that than the kids, and they don't know enough to know what is and is not. They don't have the experience of life often enough that lets one see the good in things. Which is not to say that I mean, if a kid wants to read a Bible at the lunch table, if they want to pray to them, to themselves and in their heads, you know, whisper at their seat or things like that, if they want to do that of their own free will, that I think we shouldn't do anything to prevent them. If they want to gather together of their own free will outside of class and have a prayer group, so be it. The point is they do it freely. Because guess what? Guess what? This is what's great about this country. This is what the freedom of religion is about. No religious tests, no state sponsorship or support for the church, no establishment, and no restriction on free practice. These are the fundamental bricks in the wall between church and state. And why should they be there? Why should this wall be set up? Why do we need it? Why is it good for religion for it to exist? I'll tell you why it's good. Because one does not benefit from the other. Each corrupts the other. If you have you know, with religion, God is with Christianity, God is the one you look up to, and you do it as God tells you to do. And so, if somebody co-opts Christianity in order to use it as a support for their form of government, their party, their partisan enterprise, then what are they doing? They are doing that because they want the loyalty that you have to the Almighty to flow through them. Hmm? To flow through them. They're not doing it for your good, for the good of your soul. They are co opting something that belongs to God. And also the other way around. When it's the state that imposes the requirements of a religion, when it's not simply freely agreed to, because I was born and baptized a Catholic. There was sort of a drifting away when I was a kid, and there was a period of time between when I was about 8 and about 13 where I quite simply was an atheist. I did not believe in God. I did not believe in God because I did not believe God was necessary. I learned enough about science to know that there were all these things that happened and could happen, and they happened because nature followed certain rules and things, ba ba da ba da ba da. Didn't need this extra sort of layer of things in order to work. And this is something I'm saying to all the people out there who think that that basically atheism is just a competing religion. It's not. Mm, that hit the spot. um, I believe in God's grace. I believe in God's touch. And I believe that the last thing it needs is some government person coming in and asserting this policy, this these rules by government policy. Because then it becomes about obedience to man. This is one of the things. One of the reasons why I became a Christian was I read through the Bible, I read through the gospel, and a lot of the things I objected ab- to about organized religion, a lot of those things I found in the pages of the Bible. If you read them, they're there. That's part of, it's, there's a whole set of passages about, you know, don't be this guy who has his servants blow trumpets on the street corner so that he can be seen, praying, for all to see because then they've got their reward. And that's the thing. He's saying, you do all these things, you make a show of your piety, you make a show of how great and good you are. But you look at, say, our state attorney general, Ken Paxton, not exactly following Christian behavioral codes, including one of the Ten Commandments. And yet, these people, these people will say, we're going to impose religious lessons on your children, a politicization, a state sponsorship. And they think that that's going to make things better now. It's going to be just like the kid with the kids and all the prayers and the 10 commandments and the lessons. It'll just become work for them. It will just become empty words for them. The way that the Pledge of Allegiance has for so many. I mean, how many kids recite that Pledge of Allegiance without even considering what it actually is saying? I pledge allegiance to the flag. We pledge allegiance not to some leader like Trump. We pledge allegiance to a flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. So it's made quite clear that it is a symbol. It is just a symbol, and it's the republic to which we pledge our true allegiance. One nation. Now they added under God in the 1950s. You know, did that prevent a decline in you know religiosity? Probably not. But let's go on. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. With liberty and justice for all. My education took place in the almost immediate aftermath of the civil rights era. the almost immediate aftermath of Martin Luther King and all those other people who peacefully resisted often enough, who went out there, they broke the law, mind you, but they broke the law doing things like sitting down at a lunch counter and not getting up, or getting on a bus and not yielding their seat. They broke the law in a way that was meant to show just how unfair the law was, which was meant to non-violently show that they were no longer going to just take it. When folks talk about being woke, I mean, it seems like it's a substitute. It's a way of being able to express a prejudice. When they say they're anti woke, of being able to say, to state a prejudice without actually having to own up to having that prejudice. And it's like, I mean, one of the first things Trump does in his anti DEI campaign last year, coming into power, one of the first things he does is rescind a LBJ era executive order enforcing anti discrimination laws in the federal workplace, anti discrimination laws against, you know, discrimination on account of race, gender, and that sort of thing. I mean, that's, again, we talk about the whole hate in the heart thing, but at the end of the day, a lot of what we talk about when we talk about civil rights and things like that, it's about basically fulfilling a promise. We tell people that you have, you know, you have this Bill of Rights. You have these other legal rights, but now we're saying no, you don't. Or now we're saying, well, it sort of says you have those rights, but we're going to interpret it in the most purpose defeating way we can. We're going to say, oh, you know, speaking up about discrimination is, or doing something about it is racist, is bigotry, because you're having to do something for one group of people over another, or something like that. There's been such an Orwellian twisting of words, Orwellian twisting of meanings. I mean, the way I look at it, it's like having a arriving at an accident scene, and let's say you have somebody in front of you who's, holding a broken wrist, and then you have somebody bleeding on the pavement with a fractured skull. If you treat both the same, you are either over treating one person very much, you know, or you are under treating somebody in an unconscionable way. You treat one different from the other because their situation is different. And if the other person's situation was the same, if the other person was lying bleeding on the ground, you would treat them the same way you are treating this person who is bleeding on the ground. We are dealing with the injuries of not only decades but centuries worth of deficient fulfillment of the promises of the Bill of Rights, of the general rights, constitutional and otherwise, of these our fellow American citizens. We will accord to each person the help they need in order to gain equal opportunity for them, in order to give them the chance that other people who have no, who aren't being held back by the lack of resources or the lack of, you know, the deficient education system that's often there. We're trying to remedy a problem that, in fact, previous generations caused. And it's not about white guilt. It's one of those obnoxious phrases. You know, we have a lot, there are a lot of things that have been done wrong by our ancestors. And if you can't face that, you're a coward. I don't know what to say. You have to be brave enough to face the fact that, your great grandparents were not some theme park version of, people like us. I'm pretty sure that if I go back 150 years, that if I were to talk to my ancestors, their language would likely be considerably more racist. Their attitudes towards their women considerably more sexist. These people aren't politically correct modern people in costume. These people are imperfect human beings who didn't undergo some sort of strange reverse evolution from us. You know, they, 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 they you know, it's like they were the people of their time. You didn't get the I mean, it's one of the reasons why we still tell fairy tales with kings and queens and princes and princesses in them. Why do why do we still do that in a republic, in a democracy? Why do we do that? Isn't that teaching the wrong lesson? But that's where we have the fairy tales from. I mean, we should write some new ones, I guess. Where royalty isn't such a an important thing. But in the meantime, that's what was there before, and what was there before is what evolves to become what is there now. So I don't condemn my ancestors for not being the politically correct people that people like me are today. It was a different time. It was a different time, and people had different expectations. That's not to say it was good that people believed or did things like that. But to get to the point where we are today took a lot of historical events that had not happened yet in those times, and a lot of realizations, a lot of, you know, that things had to things had to have a beginning so that the story would. That's the thing. What the framers gave us was not some perfect, you know, sterile dollhouse of a republic where everything was, just the way it was supposed to be, now and forever. Now, they gave us a system that was meant to be dynamic, that was meant to change with us, that was meant to advance with us as we learned, as we progressed, as we grew in our enlightenment. They expected us to learn better than they did, to exceed their wisdom, to exceed their knowledge. They expected that of us. But what I don't think they expected or ever thought would happen was just sort of a dark, sort of counter enlightenment. The kind of things you have Mencius mold bug or, you know, this, I think it's Charles Yarvin. They didn't expect that some people would start to believe that the appropriate sort of system would be one where, once again, some people are better than others and have a right to control others. You know? And once again, it's going to be the white people who are on top. It's going to be the men who control things. It's going to be the straight people who dominate everything, etc., etc., etc. But here's the thing: what do you want? Do you want a system where you are free and the government has to go through a long process in order to make it any other way? Or do you want a system where your freedom, your liberty, your ability to do what you want when you want to do it, to live your life, to have that life be sacred, that it all has to depend on you not getting in the way of your government? Do you want that to be the way things go? Do you want that sacred guarantee of life, liberty, and property, and happiness, and all that? Do you want that to be settled upon a system that actively allows the people to take what they want anytime you're in the way? I want a system where I take seriously what the patriots wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Behold these truths to be self-evident, as in it's just there. No need to prove it. That all men are created equal. All men. But of course, we should expand the sense of that to women, of course, and everybody's equal. There isn't one person who is born born a brighter, more shining kind of human being, uh, of gentler birth. I'm wondering what was the pain level of these gentler births. I don't think the mothers would quite agree with the notion that it's just like, oh, wow. I don't think it quite worked that way. I think they were screaming and cursing just like everybody else who goes through that process. It's this BS where people kind of, export what's in their ego, export that and to their sense of what they're supposed to be in society. To they deserve the wealth, they deserve the status, they deserve the control. Nah, people are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable rights. What is an inalienable right? It means that no matter, you can for a time say, I don't want to live. You can say that. Or I'm fine if you kill me or something like that. You can say something like that. But at the end of the day, everybody has that innate ability to say at the last moment, no, I want to live, to take back that desire to, you know, it is never lost until, up until the moment of a person's death. It is never lost that ability to want to live and that right to seek that life, to exist. Among these, life, liberty. Yeah, you put somebody in a prison, and often they'll try and escape, or they'll do what they can in order to get out of there. People want to be free. People will fight those who try to jail them, those who try to detain them, so on and so forth. The human body has natural responses to those who try to who jump them and try to bind them. The body has natural response to that. People will struggle because there is an innate wish to be free, an innate wish to be in charge of one's destiny, and the pursuit of happiness. What good would it do, really, if you had all the liberty, you had your life, but you weren't allowed to go and just do what makes you happy for the most part. No, you don't have a permit to play. You don't have a right to this sort of religion or that gives you peace, that gives you a sense of the sacred in your life. You know, I was taught to believe in this, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That this was the fundamental American value, equality, fundamental rights. And now they're trying to make it into something else. Now they're trying to convince us that if a guy kicks out a tail light, well, guess what now? He can be shot down like a dog. That's absurd. It's an absurd bit of reasoning there. And it defies not just, you know, here's the thing people need to realize is that not only is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or at least property, not only are those defined as being things that a person has an inalienable right to, in the abstract, you have the Fifth Amendment and you have the 14th Amendment basically saying that the government cannot take life, liberty, or property without following the due process of law. Why do we have that? Why make that so? Especially when there are all these guilty people around, like mobsters and stuff, who keep on doing crimes. Why don't we make it to where that the state can just take them, kill them, etc., etc.? Why don't we have a vigilante state? And the answer, when it comes down to it, is because not only are people not perfect, some of them can be real bastards. I guess this is a good point as any to finish it off, but you know, I was raised to have a sense of patriotism. I know that's kind of strange for somebody, to for many conservatives who think that people like me just want to destroy our own country, destroy our own economy. Why am I wanting to destroy my country, my economy? Because I'm embedded in that. It would hurt me. It would hurt my own. At the end of the day, I hold on to these beliefs not just because you know I've had a sense for the longest time that the conservatives, um, they've they've talked a lot about how they're the constitutional stalwarts, and I've seen them bit by bit destroying the strength of that Constitution's application to the average person. And I'm just looking at all that, and I despise the hypocrisy. I despise the failure to follow through. But you know what I don't despise? I don't despise what they taught me to be proud of. The achievements of my country, putting a man on the moon. There are, I mean, just imagine all the, if you were told back so long ago in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and in the early Industrial Age, if they had told you that one day a republic would form and that republic would send men to the moon, not once, not twice, three or four times, and they would send probes to the farthest planets, that we would see the moons of Jupiter up close. Such things are worthy of pride. That's the kind of pride I think we need. Not simply a kind of pride that says I'm better than you, but that we're better than this. that we have values that we want to uphold. It was never supposed to be just, we were never supposed to be a republic where people just sat around and prissied up about whatever rules or whatever. We were always meant to be a people who were thinking for ourselves, doing for ourselves. We were always meant to be a people who would brighten up our minds, you know, learn arts, learn invention, learn the arts of invention. We were always supposed to be not just, dull worker bees. We were always supposed to be something greater, something better than that, and want something better for ourselves. That's where the pursuit of happiness comes comes into play. That's what we're supposed to be able to do. That supposed to be able to live lives that we value, not just everybody else. That's the thing. That's what we're giving up all too often. And that is just one of many things that we give up when we bend a knee to a government that says that your rights are conditional on you complying with authority rather than the authority having to be bend a knee to due process, to the requirements of warrants and other things like that. Government powerful but constrained power, conditional power. That's what they wanted for us. They didn't want a system where folks like Trump were the masters and we the slaves. So think that all over and consider what it is you were raised, you were taught about what this country was supposed to be. Not just simply somebody doing some partisan BS, not just some church person telling you that, but really look at the framers, look at their history, and don't just go through, you know, Bill O'Reilly's latest killing book. No. There's so much this country has a right to be proud of. For all the bad things that we've done, there are things that we have a right to be proud of. And there are things that we should understand. And those things themselves will be a source of pride for us. Those achievements will be a pride for us. The fact that we will lift up all the rest of us, that we will even the playing fields, remedy the discrimination and the inequality that has plagued us since the beginning. These things that people call woke, they are ambitions for a greater, more worthy of greatness kind of nation. A nation that is more than just a bunch of nice sentiments written on a piece of paper and then ignored. No, We are better than that. We can and have done better than that. We are not doomed to just be a bunch of slaves to corporate power. We have our own destinies, our own ambitions, our own ideas. I want you to have pride in your country and in yourself. And in having pride in both, doing your best to improve both. Don't take no for an answer. Don't just let yourself be subdued, subjugated. Live as an American with all your heart, all your will. Don't let somebody else tell you that you have to sit down, shut up, comply, stay home. They don't have any power if not enough people say yes to them. That is the poison that will destroy any government. Do not pre comply. If they have the right under the law, well, then that's a different story. But otherwise, it is not your job to stand aside, to step aside every time. That's it for tonight. Have a good day. Have a good night.